In this tutorial, I'm going to explain the first phase of color grading, light adjustments. All the theories are over, let's dive into the topic. Open the Lightroom app, go to the created album and open an image. Okay, before we make any adjustments on this image, we have to crop the image properly. For that, select the crop tool. There are many things going on here, let's understand each of these things one by one. The first one is aspect ratio. By using this, you can crop your image in a fixed size. If you're going to post this on Instagram, you can crop in 4:5 ratio, or if you want to set this as your wallpaper, you can choose 9:16. Like that, you can crop it based on your purpose. If you unlock this, you can crop in any size you want. Okay, the next one is straighten. If you select this, Lightroom will automatically straighten your image by analyzing the horizon, or you can manually do that by moving this. When you're doing it manually, make sure the horizon is straight. The remaining three options are most familiar to you. Rotate is used to rotate the image, and you can flip the image horizontally or vertically by using these two options. Okay, at the top right you can find undo and redo option, and at the top left there's an option for orientation. This one is very helpful when you're cropping a landscape image. For example, if you try to crop a landscape image into Instagram ratio, you can't do that. Here will be 5:4 instead of 4:5. In this situation, you can select 5:4 and enable this option. Afterwards, you can reframe it and you're good to go. Next, I'm going to share you my few cropping secrets. In most of my grading, the subject will be in the center of the frame. So, I usually crop the image by placing the subject in the bottom horizontal line, then I will leave equal space in two sides. I'm doing this because I'll be having some space here to add typography. You can also follow this if the subject in your photo is in the center of the frame. If the subject is in any side of the frame, you can place it in these intersecting points. I also crop inside to give more importance to the subject. Alright, let's back to the actual topic. Correcting the lighting is the first thing you should do after cropping. There are multiple ways to do that, but before that, you should know about these terms: highlights, midtones and shadows. These are very simple things, but if you know it properly, you can take your grading to the next level. Highlights represents the brightest part of the image. Mostly it would be the sky. Shadows are the darkest part of the image, whereas midtones will be coming in between shadows and highlights. These areas are not too bright and not too dark, somewhere in the middle. Skin, grass, mountains or distant object will be coming under midtones. With that in mind, let's do an exercise. Take a look at this photo. Where is highlight? Where is midtones, and what about shadows? Pause the video and write your answers in the comments. Let's see how many of you got it. If you know this well, the further process will be easier for you. This graph-like thing is called a histogram. It tells you all the information about your image in terms of light and colors. If you tap this three dots and select view options, you can enable or disable the histogram. Let's figure out how it works. The left side represents the dark part of the image and the right side indicates the bright part of the image. In between these, we can find the midtones. If this white is touching the left end, shadows or the dark part of the image is clipped, which means there is no details on that part. In the same way, if the white is hitting the right end, means the image is overexposed or the highlights are blown out. We don't want to hit this white on both the left and right sides. We have to maintain a healthy contrast. I'll show you how to do this by the end of this video. Next, let's analyze the working of the tone curve. Many beginners are overcomplicating this tool because they have no actual idea on how it works. It's very simple, let me explain. Tone curve is used to control the overall exposure, contrast and colors of an image. As you see here, there are a total of 5 curves. White curve, RGB curves, which stands for red, green and blue. Then finally one more curve is here. Let's start with the basic white curve. We can split this line into 5 parts: blacks, shadows, midtones, highlights and whites. This point represents the pure black and this point indicates pure whites. If we move this black towards the right, the dark areas becomes pure black, and if we rise it up, it becomes brighter. The same goes for white point. If we move it left, the white areas becomes very brighter, and if we pull it down, it gradually reduces. I've shown this to make it clear. Below this line is darker and above it is brighter. Fine, like I said before, this is blacks and this is whites. In between these, we can find shadows, midtones and highlights. If you tap on this line, it enables a point, and if you double tap on this point, it will disappear. Okay, if you move this point down, the shadow areas becomes darker, and if you rise it up, it becomes more visible. The same goes for midtones and highlights. If you pull it down, the midtones areas becomes darker, and if you rise it up, it becomes brighter. If you move this up, the highlight areas becomes more brighter, and if you pull it down, we can see more details in the sky. Alright, hope you got it. To get a clear idea, you have to try this on your photos. You only need to use this curve if you want to create a contrast in your image. For instance, look at this image. It's very flat. Now I'll show you how you can create a contrast by only using the tone curve. For that, select the light option and enable curve. Firstly, I would add a point in shadows, then I would drag it down until the shadow areas becomes where I wanted. Okay, then I would add another point in the midtones and rise it up slowly until I'm happy. Be careful, you don't need to extend it far away. If you do that, here will be a bend like this. We don't want that. We want to make it a smooth curve, so you have to readjust this point to make it smoother. Okay, if you want even more brightness in the sky, you can add one more point in the highlights and slightly rise it up. Done. This is how I usually set the tone curve. It looks like a slight S curve. This is before and this is after. If you tap and hold on the screen, you can view the before and after adjustments. Okay, like I said before, you don't need to actually work in tone curve if the contrast in your image is perfect. Have a look at this image. Look at the histogram. It's quite contrasty. There's no details in the shadow areas. So in this situation, what you should do is, firstly you have to adjust these sliders before setting the tone curve. Let me explain how these sliders works. Exposure is the overall brightness of the image. If you increase it, the image becomes brighter, and if you pull it down, the whole image becomes darker. Contrast will affect the black and shadow part of the image. If you rise it up, that area becomes even more darker, and if you pull it down, it takes off the contrast from the image. Highlights will only affect the brightest part of the image, whereas shadows will only affect the shadow areas of the image. Whites is actually working quite similar to the highlights, it only affects the brightest part of the image. And finally, the blacks is pretty similar to contrast, it would only affect the black portion of the image. Keep in mind that the working of highlights and whites and the contrast and blacks are very similar, but there is a slight difference. Alright, you have to use these sliders in combination with the tone curve. Let me show you what I meant. Firstly, you have to analyze the image you're working with. In this image, the highlights and midtones are looking good, but there's no details in the shadows and blacks. In this situation, what I would do is rise up the shadows and I would rise up the blacks, and finally take off some contrast from the image. 3 simple moves, but huge difference. Look at the histogram. The white is not touching the dark side. Everything is on point. Like this, if you master these sliders, you can easily correct the lighting in your photos. In order to master this, you have to work in many images on different lighting conditions. The more you do it, the easier it becomes. Okay, after recovering the shadows, I would add some contrast back using the tone curve. Like we did before, pull down the shadows, rise up the midtones and readjust the shadows. Finally, slightly adjust the highlights. Fine, subtle adjustments, see the difference. Alright, next, let's analyze the working of RGB curves. You can utilize these curves in 2 ways. One is for adding contrast and saturation, and you can also use it to create your own style. But I usually use this to create contrast and boost the colors. Firstly, I would create a slight S curve in one channel, and I would set the exact same curve in the remaining green and blue channels. See the difference? It added some contrast as well as saturation. The major difference between this curve and the RGB curves are, this one will only affect the light and contrast of an image, whereas these curves can be used to adjust the colors, saturation as well as the contrast of an image. This is a bit more advanced method, but as a beginner, I would not recommend you to do this. Instead, there is an easy way. Firstly, you can fix the exposure and contrast using the basic sliders and white curve. Then you can use these sliders to add saturation. I'll explain the working of these 2 sliders in the next tutorial. In conclusion, one more curve is here. This one is used for very minor adjustments, but I usually don't even open this. You can play around with this, you may like it. Alright, hope you understand the basic light adjustments process. You have to try this on your photos to get more knowledge about this. In the next tutorial, we will learn more about the color adjustments. If you have any doubts or feedbacks, please write them in comments. Stay tuned for the next part, and thank you for your attention.